Lawyers of Reddit, what are the craziest, yet legal, last will and testament stories you had to deal with? I worked at an attorney office and little older lady gave her house and her belongings to a bus driver. The bus driver was nice to her and would help her. We were all waiting for hell to break loose when her family found out. What happens in that case? They can contest it. I was a witness to the signing. She seemed fine, knew the answers to the questions. So she wasn't having mental problems as far as we could tell. Military lawyer here. Had a young client come in for a will before deployment. He put a request to be buried in blue jeans, a Chris Jericho shirt, and his replica WWE Championship belt. Happily, this airman didn't meet any misfortune on his deployment. Has he changed the will? No idea. That was 15 years ago. Not a lawyer, but paralegal. We had a dying client in hospital change her will by recording it on a smartphone. It set a precedent and made the local paper. The lawyer in question has the page from the newspaper framed in his office. The Great Stork Derby was when a wealthy Canadian left a substantial amount of money to whichever woman had the most children in the 10 years following his death. It was upheld through numerous court battles and 4 women tied with 9 children each. 2 women were also given smaller payouts. One had 10 children, 2 were stillborn, and another had more than 9 kids. But a few were illegitimate. The guy also had some other interesting things in his will and was a known practical joker. Snopes.com. Where I went to college. There's an oak tree that was deeded to itself in a man's will. Now called the tree that owns itself. It sits in the middle of a road and you have to go to one lane to drive around it. Story is that a man loved the tree so much as a kid that around the time he died in the 1830s, he gave the tree possession of itself. This technically wouldn't stand up in a court of law, but the county and local populace has accepted it and takes care of it. The original tree actually died and the current one is a product of one of the icons of the original. Wikipedia.org. 2 sons of really wealthy couple go to the family lawyer to have the will read. Lawyer is super nervous. He has known them both since they were kids. One son gets the entire inheritance and the other gets nothing. The explanation was that it should be passed through to blood relatives only. So that was the day he found out he was adopted. Edit. A lot of people asked what happened. I only heard of this through a friend, so I don't have the full story, but the reason it went to lawyer, the person I know, was that it was being contested, so the disinherited son had to contest, I believe, over the amount. Not that his brother wasn't willing to give him anything. Crazy. I work for a lawyer who does wills. We've had a lady put in her will that one of her adult sons was not to receive his share until he visited a dentist and the other son lost 70 pounds. Another lady put in her will that she wanted her cats cremated with her when she died. Told her that's not going to happen. Human remains and animal remains do not get cremated at once. So she settled on cremated separately and joined together. Then buried together. Typically wills are about 10 pages, for the average person. We had a lady who had a 56-page will. She detailed everything from her house to people wooden ladle to toilet paper holder to magazine basket to etc. For every single item in this lady's house. We had a man put in his will that his family was to go to the zoo immediately after his burial that day. We thought that was more heartwarming. We had a lady that told us to put in her will that she wanted to be buried on her property next to her husband. She lived on a small rural property. Totally illegal to have human remains buried there. Refused to tell us whether her husband was cremated or not and had dictated that she did not want to be cremated. Edit. Her husband had died 5 or 6 years prior. So it's not as though it was 50 years where things like that may have been a little overlooked. We work with many people from a certain religion. A lot of people we do wills for leave at least 90% of their estates to the church instead of their families. There was a case study in law school involving a man who was crushed to death by a tractor. He wrote his will in the tractor tire as he lay dying. The entire tractor wheel was then filed with the county register's office. Edit. I guess it was a fender. The fender is still on display. Festa.com. My dad is a lawyer and a friend of my grandpa, who was in his 80s and had end-stage cancer, made his will. He was a big fan of weapons and wanted to give them to my dad. He's a fan too. He left him 2 shotguns, a Glock and a revolver. My dad told him it would be better to write it in the will because my country's law says you can only own 5 weapons at a time. My dad had already 4 at the time, so he would have to give some up. But if you inherit them, it doesn't add to the limit. So they made a testament and he gave him the weapons except for the revolver, because it was his favorite and didn't want to give it away yet. My dad instantly knew why but didn't say anything. 2 weeks later the guy shot himself with the revolver. He still hasn't got the revolver because police still has it. He never told my grandpa that he knew, but he didn't want to take this guy's chance of ending his life on his own terms instead of waiting for the cancer to win. Not a lawyer, but I had an experience with this years ago. Rich uncle of mine. Real crazy. Not in the good way. He would come to visit us when we were kids maybe once every 10 years. Last time he did, he brought us to Denny's. He met my brother in an airport. Was there for an hour before he got on another plane and went home. When he died he had no friends. He had driven his wife to basically drink herself to death a few years prior. He left his entire estate to an Elvis impersonator. Everything. There's a famous UK case. One of the richest men in the world at the time died during the journey between his solicitor and his country estate, all because he forgot his glasses. Took lawyers just over 100 years to spend the entire estate in legal fees. The name of the case escapes me. I think you are thinking of William Jennings. He died in 1798 and the lawsuit over his will ended in 1915. I can't understand how a lawsuit in Britain of all places could be dragged out for 100 years. I was a witness to one where the lady wanted to make sure her daughter divorced her husband, when she had no intentions of doing so, if she wanted her part of the estate. Thankfully that is not legally enforceable, so nothing came from it. What is the line in respect to conditional inheritance then? I've only ever heard of examples of proposed conditions: getting sober, graduating, not marrying person of different race, not having child out of wedlock. But I've never heard the real legal result. Are they all unenforceable? Depends on the country, but most are unenforceable. You cannot legally force an adult to do anything, unless they are operating in the realm of the illegal, and certainly not in a will. You can add caveats, but they can be usually quickly shot down in court. A will is not a legally binding contract between 2 people, unlike actual contracts and prenups. This large French farmer's family had been fighting each other for 15 years over their parents' estate. Everything and anything had been a weapon in this all-out war. Debts, spoils, barns, plots, cows, wills and whatever. Defeats followed victories. Failures followed compromises. But progress was being made. And at some point the killing zone turned to a standstill. Everything was agreed as long as no one talked antics. Jewelry, furnitures, kitchenware, photographs, laundry or tools. A long protracted period ensued. Any goodwill tentative harshly discouraged before even being aired. Time went on with no issue in sight. Then someone suggested they just drag all the stuff into the farm's courtyard, pour petrol on it, and set it all afire. Everyone agreed. Not the lawyer, but worked in the wills and trusts part of a financial firm. Conditional trusts wills about the trustee having to be clean and sober to receive their money were pretty normal. But the weirdest one I saw was a guy who wanted to set up a trust that said his daughter could only receive a monthly payment from the trust he'd set up if she remained below a certain, quite low, weight. He was setting it up while still alive, but it was a perpetual trust, so that rule would stay in place after he died. I can't imagine having such a controlling parent that they feel the need to dictate how much I weigh from beyond the grave. My brother used to be a paralegal, and he said that a group of 3 siblings, I believe 2 brothers and a sister, almost came to blows because the inheritance didn't divide into 3 evenly. There were 2 pennies left over. Estate lawyer here. I could tell so many stories. Sisters fighting over deceased brother's dining room table, ending in an accusation that one had murdered her own husband. True believers who were convinced the rapture was imminent and only saw the value of completing their estate plan when I explained the mess those of us left behind would have to deal with, including their stuff. A guy who got married days before his death to a longtime girlfriend. Long story. Did a will. Disinherited several kids but not all. And somehow everything worked out okay with minimal disagreement. Several stories where a family member is a lawyer who practices in another area of law in another state, or doesn't practice at all. Guaranteed craziness. I could go on and on. It's the absolute best line of work. Super fulfilling. Great stories. Get to know families. And walk meaningful paths alongside them. I mean, it's not that crazy. It's depressingly predictable. Rich old aunt, the only one in her huge family with any money. Having been a doctor on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, she set up a living trust to take care of her poor relations in the Philippines, to continue as a death trust whenever she died. Her favorite niece was in control of the trust. And of course the niece was responsible and even-handed and never ever embezzled any of the money to set herself up as a newspaper publisher and concert producer and media mogul with new expensive cars and lots of first-class Pan-Pacific travel. Nope. Not her. Of course the trustee did all that. Hundreds of thousands of dollars missing. And an unholy mess of sifting through money transfers and property purchases in 3 countries. The niece also had a bigamous marriage to some loser in the Philippines. Her legal husband in North America was bedridden and dying slowly, to whom she sent buckets of her aunt's money to build a luxury villa. She vehemently denied such a relationship existed. She also had photos of the wedding on her Facebook page. Not the smartest embezzler out there. From where I sat in the attorney's office representing the poor relations trying to stop the trustee's embezzlement, the craziest part of it all was that after years of fighting, we finally got complete financial disclosure for the trust on like the 22nd of December. And it was such a Christmas miracle that I almost put off my Christmas trip to Nick to gleefully bore through every poorly redacted line of it. Also, we had the rich old aunt's ashes sitting on our bookshelf for years, since the dispute about what to do with her remains was part of it all. I saw a couple giving $100,000 to the next caretakers of their pets. Not a lawyer. But that's the craziest I saw from our clients. I have a restatement in mind saying that my sister will be awarded $10,000 to care for my cat if some Fiji happens to me. But that's because he has a lot of medical issues and his vet bills can reach $1,000 pretty quick each time anything happens. And I don't want her going into debt taking care of my pet. Steady Ed Hedrick, the inventor of the frisbee, had his ashes melted into some frisbees. Not a lawyer. Just a guy who grew up in California throwing the things. Not a lawyer, but I have a crazy story. My grandma's sister was an narcissist and extremely vindictive. She and her husband gained a significant number of assets over the years, including a somewhat profitable farm with over 100 acres of fields. They had a few children. All boys. And they all had wives and children of their own. Her husband died about 6 years before she did. Somehow, in their 50+ years of marriage and living on said farm, had they never bothered to go to a lawyer and write a will. Instead, she wrote a note and left it in their safe of legal documents saying that nothing was to go to wife of son who died almost 20 years ago, or her children, and said aunt's grandchildren. This because the son's wife was more outspoken and wouldn't be controlled by her. Aunt absolutely despised her, and my entire family too. So everything went into probate and the kids are still trying to get everything squared away a year later. But the people she wanted excluded should be getting something out of it too. The local newspaper ran a story with pictures of a house that was left to a cat when the owner died. The cat was the only occupant. The woman's lawyer maintained the house for the cat from the deceased owner's trust fund. I always wondered if there might have been a little motivation to hasten Kitty's demise. Not so much the original will itself but the aftermath and greed of the siblings. Almost none of them talk anymore, 10x total. They're fighting over a couple hundred acres, most of which is swamp. The greed part is they had the original will amended. Every grandkid was supposed to get a portion in the original will along with the siblings, however the siblings nixed that via courts. They were going to then split the property among themselves, but the executor just didn't give a duck and let it sit for 30 years without doing shit. The rest wanted it done, so court cases. Massive debts. Finally the executor no longer has control. Thanks to the court cases the property was in massive debt, which is sort of paid off right now, and now they are all too old or dead to do anything with it. If the will had gone through as originally stated, the family, which consists of about 35 grandchildren, would have all been happy there or had money for selling the property, which is worth about 35k a lot. Now it's probably just going to go under eventually for non-payment. Even if I could buy some of it for cheap, I'm not touching it with 100-mile pole. Fairly new lawyer. Haven't had that much in wills areas. Family is where the real fun is, but did have a woman with dementia come in to do her will. Then come in a few months later to change it. Because her condition was worsening. I did a capacity assessment and she seemed to understand what her old will said. What her new will would say. Why she was changing it. Wasn't suddenly cutting anyone close out. So I made the changes. Told her okay. But warned her that I might not be able to make future changes due to concerns about her condition. A week later she comes back in and she's in rough shape. She remembers me but her eyes are watering. She has some trouble explaining what's going on. I realize she's not even trying to change her will. She's just sort of here because she's scared about the changes in her head. So I get in touch with the person supposed to be caring for her. I talk over her will one more time. I tell her she's done everything right. Her will is safe. Her family knows where it is, etc. When I said goodbye I told her I hope to see her again. And she smiled and said she didn't think we would. I teared up a little. We'd laughed and chatted through her original will. Discussed the best ways to do things. Seeing this formerly confident and witty woman. Still keeping it together but obviously so concerned and knowing it was a one-way downward path. It sucked. I don't know how she's doing now. Not a lawyer. But when my dad was growing up there was this little old lady across the street without any family. She was from Finland and her husband died during WW2. She immigrated to the States and had no one. So my grandparents would knock on her door to chat. Take her grocery shopping. etc. They made my dad and brother help out around her house yard etc. She loved my dad and uncle. Treated them like her own kids. Cookies and treats and presents. When dad was in Vietnam, she would record him voice messages on tapes and send them to him with letters telling him what life was like in the neighborhood and how she hoped he'd be home safe soon. That she prayed for him etc. When he came home, he'd stop by to chat and help out around the house. Bring her macaroons and just sit and talk for a while. One day Mrs. Linger died and a lawyer called my grandparents. She had left them a sizable amount of cash and stock. And her paid off house to my dad and his brother. My family had thought she was penniless. Never underestimate how much little simple things can mean to people. You just might be one of the best things in their life. I was in rehab with a guy whose grandmother left him $2.5 million if he could quit heroin for 2 years. He would have to wear one of those drug patches that the courts use for probationers the entire time. Which are exceptionally hard to fool. $2.5 million? Slam dunk. Right? This was 2007. Last time I saw him was in 2013. Nodded the duck out in a Fleabag motel. While I left to pick up another sack. I got arrested. Made the decision to quit and never saw him again. Who knows? Maybe since then he's cleaned up. This family didn't realize I had nothing to do with the will. One kept telling me to tell the deceased they were unhappy with their decisions. Another thanked me personally for gifting them the house. My grandpa gave all his belongings to my father, which was the youngest of 4 brothers and 3 sisters while my grandma was still alive. grandpa told my dad that he gave him everything rightfully because he believed my dad will split everything equal. Grandma wanted her property back. Dad at the time only 20 obeyed his mom. Big fucking court case several years later between all the brothers because it was indeed not evenly split. Still going strong to this day with no grandma around anymore. Grandpa was a wise man. Just miscalculated. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a sad story that fit here. My great grandmother and grandfather had a will that would give their 6 kids a fair share when they both were dead. But my grandfather passed and the oldest of the kids, the jerk, took it to court to get his part even if the will said that they would get their share when both were dead. This made my great grandmother lose everything. She didn't get to handle the sorrow of losing her husband whom she'd been married to for 68 years. Instead she had to go to court many times and then she lost the house they had built and almost everything she owned. We helped her get an apartment and tried to keep her happy. She deteriorated quickly after those months. I hate how someone can let the greed come between families. I've never met the jerk. I had a guy want to give his car to his daughter and split his 3 accounts with his son and daughter. I've only done one and I probably won't do any more lol. Not a lawyer, but the Hugh Get Clark story is utterly fascinating to me. She died in 2011 at age 104. She was a wealthy recluse, daughter of a copper baron, who hadn't seen any family since her mother passed away in 1963. She lived the last 20 years of her life in a hospital in Manhattan, having contact with only a handful of people, and rarely had face-to-face interactions. Of her $300 million fortune, she gave most to charity, including her palatial estates. $30 million to her longtime nurse. $1 million to the hospital. Money to the caretakers of said palatial estates. Her accountant and lawyer. And nothing to her distant relatives. Except all that was written in her second will, which was written 6 weeks after the first. Here's a detailed story about the legal battle. I have a grandpa who set up his will to divide his estate between his and his wife's, he remarried, families. Pretty normal so far. Stupid part is that rather than splitting his half between the 3 children, he did per capita, to be distributed after his wife passes. So we currently have a 9-way split, and likely 10 to 15 ways before it's actually settled. I have heard that if a charity is a % recipient of a will, they will sometimes send lawyers to make sure that all the accounting is done to ensure their share is the full size granted. In effect trying up probate for years and greatly increasing costs. Lawyers suggested instead only granting charities a specific account to avoid the problems. Any truth to that? I read a will that was pretty normal up until the decedent asked that his cremated ashes be sprinkled on the crotches of well-endowed teenage boys. Maybe he was trying to be funny. There was a case story from someone who was in law school of a generational trust. This says, all my grandchildren get $sign when the youngest reaches the age of 25. The youngest grandchild was 24. And they were all making plans for their inheritance. Plot twist. One of the sons remarried and had a baby, a new heir, when the other grandchildren were 24. So they had to wait until they were 50 plus to inherit. Edit. I asked if the baby had a bodyguard. And my friend didn't know. I think one of the grandchildren was in law school and was a classmate of my friend, who told me the story. This was in the 1990s, I believe. Not a lawyer, but I used to work at a bank in the estates department. I was an administrator who had to manage the files including encroachments upon the capital. That is, I want to take some money out now. Please don't. I had this one account, multi-million-dollar trust for one single beneficiary, the son of the deceased. What's interesting is that the son held the parents with a hammer in grotesque and brutal fashion. He plead insanity. He would call once a year from the penitentiary mental hospital, requesting $50 for commissary to buy chips and gum. The call was always strange. He was very polite, very doped up. The quality of the call was always very tinny, like he was far away from the phone.